Okay, Chapter 1, Experiencing Theater Past and Present. Let's talk a little bit about how to spell theater first. You'll see it spelled both ways, theater with an R-E and with an E-R. Neither is particularly more correct than the other way. Theater with an R-E is more European spelling, where E-R is an Americanized version. And then also, additionally, some people will use R-E to refer to specifically the art of theater, like I work in the theater, or I'm going to see a play at a theater, in which case you might use an ER to refer to the place. But that's just personal preference, whichever you like to use, as long as you're consistent. You'll see that I usually use RE, but you can use either way. Again, consistency is really what counts here. So how would you define theater? If you had to define theater or use words to describe it, what words would come to mind? And I'll give you a few moments to think. If you had to define theater, or if I say the word theater, what pops to mind there? So, some words that frequently come up when I ask my classes this question. Words like acting. You think about actors, performers, maybe on a stage, a raised stage surrounded with scenery. Perhaps the actors have costumes on. The word performance comes up a lot because obviously the actors are performing for you. Red curtains, that's kind of the iconic classic image of what a traditional theater looks like, red curtains surrounding a raised stage. Storytelling, theater is a form of storytelling. And then musical comes up a lot too. And notice that the word musical, referring to musical theater, is referred to as genre or a category or type of theater. Other genres of theater are comedy, tragedy, melodrama, children's theater, etc. So genre just refers to the category or type of theater. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about genre later on. So the textbook defines theater, and this is on page 8, as a dramatic presentation by actors on some kind of stage before an audience. So a fairly simple, straightforward definition. You'll notice a lot of the phrases that might have popped to mind, like actors and stage and audience, are in this definition, so it's pretty all-encompassing. But it's not the best definition out there. And in fact, if you're trying to take thousands of years of storytelling, essentially of theater, and condense it down into a sentence, describe it in a sentence, that's pretty hard. So Edwin Wilson, your textbook author, did an admirable job doing just that. But let's sort of look at this definition a little bit closer and pick it apart. Something else to notice, he uses the term theatrical arts to refer to the type of theater that we're most used to. So most Western theater he's describing as theatrical arts. He also uses the term performative activities, which are activities or performances that have some aspects of theater that are like theater in a lot of ways, but aren't strictly theater. There are some deviations. And this is different than the performing arts, which includes theater, but it can also include other forms of performance as well, like dance or opera or other performing art activities. So let's examine Wilson's definition a little more closely. Dramatic presentation by actors on some kind of stage before an audience. And is there anything that strikes you as odd about this phrase or this definition, and anything that might need further definition? So look back over it again. Any words or phrases in there that are kind of weird, that might need some definition, that are a little confusing. So I'll give you a few seconds to think here, to look back over that definition. The phrase dramatic presentation, that's probably the first thing that you locked onto, or one of the things that you looked at. The word dramatic, you might have wondered what that meant exactly, and we sometimes see the word drama being used synonymously with theater to mean the same thing as theater, like I'm going to drama class, or I belong to the drama club, meaning theater class, theater club. And so it's a little confusing there. The two words are sometimes synonymous. The word drama can be defined as a composition of prose or verse presenting in dialogue or pantomime a story involving conflict or contrast of character, especially when intended to be acted on the stage, i.e. a play. So drama, within the context, a dramatic presentation by actors on some kind of stage before an audience, can really be defined as conflict. And that word, we use the word drama to mean conflict colloquially in everyday life as well. If you watch The Maury Show or Jerry Springer, you see one of those baby mama drama episodes where, is he the father, isn't he the father, the DNA test episodes. That word drama, baby mama drama, means conflict, and you see a lot of conflict on these shows. And in fact, most stories in the theater, if not all stories within the theater, are going to have some measure of conflict, because it's a little boring without some sort of conflict. So two people or two groups of people struggling to overcome obstacles, to gain a goal, or something like that. So you're going to see conflict in stories, and the word drama, when you see that, when you hear it, think conflict, because that's another synonym for drama. Now, drama itself is not a genre. Remember, G-E-N-R-E. Drama isn't a genre, except in like movies. Sometimes you'll see, if you go to Blockbuster, the drama section. In theater, we don't really have drama plays. They're all dramatic. They all involve conflict. So drama is referring to all theater in the theatrical context. So, dramatic presentation, a story involving conflict of some kind is usually what that means. A presentation of a story involving conflict. And what other phrase up there might be a little bit strange? So usually, I'm sorry, I went backwards a little. Usually, the next thing that people will notice is some kind of stage before an audience. If that's kind of a weird phrase to stick into a textbook definition, and I think the reason he did this was originally the definition read by actors on a stage before an audience. And then he probably got some feedback that, hey, we can do theater in other places other than just a stage, which is primarily traditionally what we think about when we think of theater. We think of a stage, but it could happen anywhere. It could happen outdoors, like theater in the park, Miller Outdoor Theater, which does have a raised, formalized stage as outdoor theater, or you could literally do theater in a park without an actual formal stage. Street theater, on a street corner or a town square, that's not too uncommon, especially in large cities. Or theater could happen in converted spaces that weren't meant to be theaters, like old warehouses. Or in Chicago, they'll take older storefronts and convert those storefronts into theaters. So it doesn't have to be on a stage like we traditionally think of, although you're probably going to experience that sometimes this semester. Let me go to the next slide. So that leads us with two other terms, by actors and before an audience. And theater is live. That's what separates it from other entertainment forms like television and film. So you'll always have a live audience watching live actors. And when you do, you have what's called the performer-audience relationship. Both parties acting on each other. So the performer is affecting the audience is affecting the performance. So the performer-audience relationship, this is a pretty important term to familiarize yourself with, and you'll see it again. We'll talk about it again throughout the semester. So both parties are acting on each other. The performers are changing, altering the audience is changing and altering the performance. All right, if we advance, so to recap and explain, according to the textbook, to Edwin Wilson, theater is a dramatic presentation, which we can define as the presentation of a story involving conflict by live actors on some kind of stage, but maybe not the one you're used to seeing, before a live audience. So a dramatic presentation by actors on some kind of stage before an audience. Now there's another quote from your book on page 7. Taken in its broadest sense, theater is everywhere around us. And sometimes this quote confuses people. That doesn't mean that these other events, which are theatrical or performative in nature, are theater. So weddings, funerals, graduations, that's not really theater. When we think of theater, we think of Western theater. They're theatrical, they have a lot of elements that are like theater, but they aren't theater. They're performative events or performative activities. And in fact, there's an extra credit assignment on Blackboard Learn where you can attend a performative activity and then write me a compare and contrast paper about how it's similar to theater and how it's different than theater. So an example that your book gives is weddings, that they are theatrical performative events, and we know that a wedding isn't theater in the way that we usually define theater, but it is very similar in many ways. So let's look at a wedding a little more closely. A wedding versus traditional theater. So think about, how is a wedding similar to theater? When you think of a wedding, are there elements, are there occurrences that are similar to theater, that are very similar to a theater type setting? So some ways a wedding might be similar to traditional theater is that there are costumes. The bride wears white, which is a symbolic color. The men usually wear tuxedos. Everyone there has sort of a certain dress code, and so you can really tell somebody's role. If they're bride, a bridesmaid, groomsman, groom, mother of the bride, the priest, or the rabbi or the reverend. You can usually tell who they are based on what they're wearing. So they're wearing costumes, just like in theater. There might be memorized lines, so vows that have been prepared and memorized in advance, so it's not completely spontaneous. And because of that, there's usually a rehearsal dinner or a rehearsal beforehand, so everyone knows when to walk down the aisle, when to say what and to do what. So much like a theater, they're rehearsing what we call blocking, which is the movement of actors on stage. They're rehearsing their blocking and their lines. There also might be decorations very similar to scenery, might be predetermined decorations and flowers that go along with a certain type of theme to communicate something about the couple to the audience. And it's also a live event, like live theater. The ways that a wedding is different than traditional theater, the actions in a wedding have consequences. So on stage, if you're pretending to get married, you're pretending. Your characters are getting married, but the actors aren't actually getting married. But in real life, in a real wedding, obviously this is a legally and culturally binding ceremony, and so now afterwards you are man and wife. There's not actors portraying the characters, but these are real people in a wedding, whereas if this was a wedding on stage, it would be actors pretending to be portraying characters, people that they are not. And so a wedding is real life, whereas theater is not real. We try to make it seem real often, but it is not reality. It's a presentation of a story, a presentation of an alternate or a different or a false reality. So the conclusion, performative activities are very similar to theater, but they are not theater. They are different in a few key ways. So we define theater, we've looked at how it is like performative activities. Let's go ahead and think about the subject of theater. Theater everywhere is about what? What is all theater everywhere about? It's about, the subject of theater is always human beings, human conflict, or people. So theater everywhere is about human beings. But I say that, and I bet you can think of some plays that don't seem to be about theater, or some stories that don't seem to be about people, don't seem to be about humans or human conflict. So I'll give you a moment to think, what are some plays that on the surface, they seem like they're about something other than people? So you might have said or thought, The Lion King, a very popular play on Broadway, and it since has toured across America. Cats, another popular Broadway play. Alice in Wonderland, A Christmas Carol. So there are characters in these plays that are animals, might be objects. If you thought of something like Beauty and the Beast, where we have objects that are actually the candlestick, the teapot, whatever, that are actually the characters. Ghosts or gods and goddesses, or other characters that don't seem to be human, that are inhuman characters. So these plays, on their surface, don't seem to be about people. Notice that, as a side note, that these plays are all italicized, so you always put play titles in italics when you're writing about them. So, okay, these plays do seem to be about animals or magical beings, which aren't human, but are they really about those things? Or are they actually about human conflict? And I would posit that they are. For example, The Lion King is loosely based on the story of Hamlet, except it has a much happier ending than Hamlet does. But do lions really sing and dance, fall in love, try to conquer their evil uncle? Not really. They don't have relationships in the same way that humans do. These are human emotions and human actions. Similarly, cats. Same thing with cats. It's a very famous piece of musical theater, so theater that uses song and dance to help tell the story. And I'm pretty sure my cat doesn't sing and dance when I'm not around, or at least I hope so. So these are actions, these are emotions, situations that are uniquely human, that animals and gods and goddesses and magical beings do not partake in, or they don't exist in some cases. So this is what we call personification, when you attribute a human characteristic to things that aren't human. So like in Beauty and the Beast, where we have the candlestick and the teapot and the clock as characters. Clearly these are personified objects because these objects don't talk or communicate, don't sing and dance, don't feel emotions. So we're putting human attributes, human characteristics onto these objects or animals or other non-human beings. So even when a story is about something other than humans, they are engaging in uniquely human activities. So all plays everywhere are about human beings, human conflict, people. And because we like conflict in our stories, usually these human conflicts are very human, like power struggles or love triangles or family dysfunction. Okay, so we've looked at the definition of theater. We've talked about performative activities, how they're like theater but aren't theater. And then we talked about what theater is about. It's always about people and human conflict. Finally, we can break theater down into 6 basic elements. So if you go to see a play, or when you go to see your plays this semester, you're probably going to run into all 6 of these elements in some form or another. So these are the basic building blocks of theater. The first one is the audience. So the audience is always live. They are engaging in the performer-audience relationship. They are interacting with the audience and acting and reacting on each other. So the audience, a very important part of theater. Second is the venue, the place where this is occurring, so the space or environment in which it occurs, and it can be a traditional theater like we mentioned, or it could be outdoors, it could be in a converted space, and we'll talk about different types of theaters and venues a little later in the semester. The performers, so you'll have actors and actresses, but you might also have other performers as well, dancers, jugglers, other performance arts in the theater. The director, a very important person, his or her supervision will guide the process. They oversee the entire production process, and they have a vision or concept that everyone is working towards. So the director is kind of the head honcho. The playwright is where the story is originates, where it is created, and so the playwright writes a script, and the script is the blueprint for everyone else to create the play. And we'll talk about the playwright more in depth in the next unit. And there's a quote from your book, this is on page 11. Unlike a novel, a play is written to be performed. So novels, poetry, essays, these are all written to be read, to sit down and read, to interact with on a one-on-one basis. But a play is actually meant to be performed. It's not meant to be read. So even though we read one in class, the Glass Menagerie, so remember to get a copy of the Glass Menagerie, read it by the date in the syllabus. But even though we read this play and we analyze and talk about it, that's not the purpose. Tennessee Williams wrote it to be performed on stage. So the actual end result is the performance, not the script itself. And then next, visual effects. So what you see on stage, the costumes, the scenery, the lighting, and then also the sound, which is technically the aural effects, so what you hear. But all of these effects on stage should be unified and work together to help create and tell the story. Now, in commercial theater, the producer would be a seventh element of theater. We'll talk about commercial and non-commercial theater in a moment, but the producer is the person who raises funding for the production and oversees the entire financial side of a production. So the producer only exists in commercial theater. We don't really have a producer in non-commercial theater. Rather, that job is broken up between the artistic director and the managing director, which we'll talk about in a second. So commercial versus non-commercial theater, and these are sometimes called for-profit or not-for-profit theater. Commercial theaters, the funding comes from investors, so they will give money up front before the production is even realized, and they're banking on the fact that the play is going to do really well, it's going to make a lot of money, and they're going to get their money back plus interest at the end. And so it's kind of a risky venture. And the producer is in charge of going out, finding these funders, and working out the logistics and the details of what that investment is going to be. Ticket prices for commercial theater are usually much higher because they are trying to make enough money back to pay back their investors, as well as pay for everything else, like people's salaries and the scenery, the costumes, etc. So they're trying to make enough money back. So ticket prices for commercial theater on Broadway might be in the $100 to $150 range per seat, so depending on the show. So that's pretty expensive just to go spend a couple of hours in a theater. But the reason is because it's a commercial theater, and so most of their money is coming from ticket sales and then also merchandise sales. If you buy a t-shirt or a CD in the lobby, you're also contributing to the production. In non-commercial theater, funding usually comes from a different source. It comes from grants and donations. So big businesses or philanthropists will give money or they'll receive grants from places like the NEA or the Houston Arts Alliance to produce their shows. And so the money's not coming from ticket sales, and they don't have to pay that money back. So it's a slightly different funding structure. Because of that, the tickets can be a little bit lower. So you go to see something at the Alley Theater, the tickets might be in the $20 to $40 range. If you go to see something at Catastrophic Theater, they actually make enough money from grants and donations that all of their tickets are pay what you can, meaning literally if you have $5 in your pocket, that's what they'll take. They'd rather you come see the show than not see the show. In non-commercial or nonprofit theater, usually there's an artistic director who will choose the season, choose the plays they're doing, hire the director, oversee the artistic parts of the season, the productions, and then the managing director who is overseeing financing, budgeting, time management, things like that. So they're kind of taking the responsibilities of a commercial producer and splitting it into two different people. So that's what you usually find in a nonprofit or non-commercial theater. I mentioned the Alley Theater and that it's a regional theater. What is a regional theater? Well, a regional theater is a theater specifically founded to create and produce high quality, good quality professional theater that will serve a region. So for example, in the early to mid 20th century, so 1930s, 40s, if you wanted to go see a high quality, good production play, then you probably have to travel to Chicago or Los Angeles or New York. And if you didn't live close to one of those, then you probably didn't see a lot of good theater. And so people recognize that not everyone can travel, and especially earlier in the 20th century, it's a little bit harder to travel far from your home. And so people like Nina Vance founded regional theater. She founded the Alley Theater to serve a region, to do professional level theater in an urban environment. So you'll find regional theaters in places like Austin or Atlanta or Houston or Phoenix, and they basically serve a region, serve an area that doesn't have a lot of theater. And regional theaters become extremely popular. There's over 1,000 regional theaters now across the United States. In fact, that's edging up closer to 2,000 theaters now. The last section of your book talks about multi-ethnic, multicultural, global, and gender theater. So different types of theater, varieties of theater, such as African American theater, feminist theater, and avant-garde theater. And Houston has a huge theater population. We have more theater seats than any other city in North America, excluding New York itself. So we have a lot of theater going on in town. And these different types, these different varieties of theaters are thriving. So there's a list on Blackboard Learn. I think it's just called MultiEthnic Theatre. It's under Readings. If you go to Readings and then open MultiEthnic Theatre, there's a list of African American theaters in town, Asian theaters, Hispanic theaters, gay and lesbian theaters, and avant-garde theaters here in town, as well as links to their website. So this isn't an exhaustive list. These are just the ones that I know of, have heard of. So if you know of another theater that might fit into one of these categories, feel free to let me know. But for example, we'll take the Ensemble Theater, which is just down the street from campus on Main Street. You can actually take the rail to get there. It was founded in 1976 with the intent to preserve African American artistic expression, to enlighten, entertain, and enrich a diverse community. So their stories are usually going to be about or from the point of view of the African American demographic, and thus that's largely what their audience serves as well. Although of course they'd be happy for you to come see their plays if you are not African American. These types of theaters also generally serve demographics that are underrepresented in mainstream Western theater. So mainstream Western theater is usually by white, straight males. And so if you don't fall into all of those categories, your point of view might be a little underrepresented in modern theater. And so these types, these varieties of theaters are founded usually to focus on other varieties, lesser represented varieties of theater. On Blackboard Learn, there's another reading called A Typical Production Process, which we will take a moment to go look at now. So it's under the Readings folder. A typical production process, notice it is in quotation marks. So meaning that not all theaters will adhere strictly to this particular format or process, but I think most theaters will. So in this first paragraph, you'll notice some of these terms are already familiar to you. Some of them are in bold, like producer or director, so these are people, these are jobs. And then others, like production or regional theater, are in italics. And then a lot of these other terms you might not be familiar with quite yet, but we will go over them throughout the semester. So if we begin at the top up here with a theater production is kicked off in a variety of ways. On Broadway, a producer, so the person raising funds, may begin to raise funds for a certain production. And notice the word production. We call the production of each version of a play a production. So for example, if I was going to produce The Glass Menagerie, that would be my production of The Glass Menagerie. So it would be slightly different than your production of The Glass Menagerie. We'd cast different people, we'd have a slightly different interpretation, so there'd be two different productions. So when Theater A does The Glass Menagerie and Theater B do The Glass Menagerie, they're two different productions of the same play. So if you're going to begin a production on Broadway, usually the producer will try to find funds, find investors to help pay for everything. In educational or regional theater, a director or an artistic director may choose the plays for that season. And sometimes the playwright, the person creating the play, is still alive and may become involved in the production. And this is true often of new plays that are being workshopped, meaning they're being written or they're being altered while they're directed. But often the playwright's either dead or uninvolved with the production itself, leaving most or all of the choices to the directors. The director's making all of the choices, and hopefully they have a vision of what the final product's going to be, and they work with all of these other people, which we'll talk about in just a second, the different designers, the actors, etc., and try to shape what their performance is going to be and what the final product is going to be towards this directorial vision. Second paragraph, once the play is in a director's hands, he or she will work out a directorial vision or concept. And so this can be very detailed, down to the color schemes, vocal accents, and furniture. Sometimes it's very vague, allowing actors and designers more free reign. Usually the concept is somewhere in between these two extremes, between vagueness and making decisions about every tiny little thing. The director will meet with the scenic, costume, lighting, sound, and media designers to discuss the concept and how it affects their various areas. The designers are often aided by a dramaturg, someone who does research, provides insight into the world of the play. They can be an invaluable resource. Designers will work up initial sketches and ideas. Through several meetings, these sketches will be altered until the design team arrives at the final designs. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester, and I'll show you some examples of sketches and renderings. Toward the end of the design process, sometimes after and in rare cases before, the director holds a casting call, and so they try to find who is going to be appropriate, who are the right actors for these roles. Here the actors audition for roles in an upcoming production. After rounds of auditions and callbacks, meaning you might go for an audition, maybe 100 people were there, they decide we really liked these 20, and they'll call you back to come audition again, kind of like in the American Idol format. The director will then finalize his cast, usually after those callback auditions. After the cast is finalized, they will begin rehearsals. Notice it's not practices, so we rehearse in theater, we don't practice. Begin rehearsals in a temporary space, often a large room with the set taped out on the floor. So not in the theater itself, not with the actual scenery and props quite yet. And props, which is short for properties, literally means the objects on stage. The designers will present their work to the cast in these very first rehearsals so that the actors can understand what they're acting on, what they're acting in, as in their costumes, and under, regarding the sound and lights. Meanwhile, while the actors are rehearsing, the scenery and costumes are being built by very skilled craftspeople. And these include carpenters, painters, electricians, cutters, drapers, stitchers, etc. Notice etc. because there's a lot of other people that work backstage and behind the scenes that you will learn about this semester. When the scenery and costumes are finished, or nearly so, they load in the scenery, costumes, lights, sound, and media equipment into the performance space. So load-ins when you take everything and you actually put it in the theater. And then after load-in, the actors are allowed to rehearse on the scenery and under the light, so they get a chance to feel what it'll really be like during an actual production. These are referred to as technical rehearsals. This process of rehearsing on stage with all of the different elements are technical rehearsals. And once the technical rehearsal process is nearing an end, the actors are allowed to rehearse in their costumes and their makeup, and these are referred to as dress rehearsals. So usually we wait at least a rehearsal or two to let them get used to all the other elements before we throw costumes and makeup and wigs and what have you at them. After one final dress rehearsal, there's often a preview, which is where we allow audience members in to watch the production and sort of gauge their reaction. After the rehearsal period's over, the show is ready to open, and productions run from one day, if it's a really bad show, to several years, depending on their size, scope, and popularity. So in commercial theater, the show will keep going as long as it's making money. So shows on Broadway can last for months or maybe even years in cases of plays like A Chorus Line, because they're still making money. Some productions will travel, meaning that they go from city to city, so they will repeat the load-in and the technical rehearsal process at each new venue. When a production is through, it closes, so the last night is closing night. After the show closes, a crew is brought in to strike. The set, lights, costume, and all the stuff that's in the theater gets taken out during strike. Often, though, scenery is thrown away or given away to smaller theatrical organizations unless the show is expected to reopen at another venue or become a road show and travel. So a show will open, run for a period, could be a few weeks, could be several months, and then will close. So that completes a typical production process. I've also directed you to read Why Theater Matters. This is on Blackboard Learn under Readings. It's interviews with several theater artists and audience members discussing why they think theater matters. And in this day and age, when it's competing with a lot of other media, television, YouTube, movies, it's kind of important to reflect and realize what makes theater different and special, and why it is valuable. And I've gone through and I've highlighted some particularly interesting quotes. So if you go to Blackboard Learn, you can download and look at why theater matters. You'll see I've highlighted some quotes. I won't go on. We won't read this together. I'll ask you to read it on your own. But notice I've highlighted the first section here. Talk to people who love theater about why they love theater, and you'll hear one word over and over, and that word is live. Another word that comes up a lot is stories. Live stories. That's pretty much what it's all about. Real people in real time telling real stories. And notice it goes on to say those stories can be filled with singing kitty cats, like cats, or battles between one messy and one neat roommate, like in The Odd Couple. But they're about people, and they're about stories that people like and identify with, and they're live. And that aspect of liveness is something that really makes theater special and different than a lot of other performance or entertainment media. So go through, read that on your own. And that concludes our lecture over Chapter 1. Now you're ready to go on and watch and read Chapter 2.